بسم الله الحمد لله الصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى أزواجه وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and greetings. My name is Ismail Royer. I am Director of the Islam and Religious Freedom section at the Religious Freedom Institute in Washington, D.C. And I wanted to offer something that you're not going to hear very much of in the forthcoming days, just as you haven't heard much of it before today, and that is a theologically orthodox conservative view of Roe versus Wade and today's Supreme Court opinion in Dobbs that overturns that opinion and overturned Planned Parenthood versus Casey. So I don't have any thing prepared, but I'm just going to speak off the cuff, and then hopefully we'll follow up with some more systematic writing, inshallah. It's something that will be coming out in Muslim Matters in the forthcoming days or weeks, inshallah. So here's what there are two very important points that need to be understood. Number one, and this is perhaps the least interesting and the least important, and that is, to what extent did Roe actually allow or make lawful things that or actions that in Islam that Islam also permits? Okay, well, first of all, Roe v. Wade allowed abortions to be carried out at any time up until so-called viability without restriction. So viability means, in the language of Roe v. Wade, it means that the child is able to survive on its own outside the womb. So we know that by consensus of the Sunni Muslim scholars that the angel blows the soul into the child at 120 days of gestation, or 120 days from conception. Viability, a child is able to survive outside the womb, not able to survive outside the womb until after that. And so that means that Roe allowed, without restriction, allowed the killing of innocent souls in the womb after the soul has been blown into the infant. And so, moreover, that Roe allowed the killing of these children in the womb far after viability, until the and really without any real restriction. And it permitted states to impose some restrictions after viability, but without imposing a so-called undue burden. That was in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, and then that is as vague as it sounds, undue burden. So what that means is, as a Muslim, you cannot, and I say as a Muslim kind of ironically, because usually, like, as a Muslim precedes some statement that is entirely unorthodox. But in any event, as a Muslim, you cannot both agree that it is the unlawful murder of an innocent soul after the soul has been blown in after 120 days, the unlawful killing. And this is the word qitā. This is the word that the ulama used. You cannot both agree with this, which there's ijma', there's agreement on this, that it is unlawful killing to abort a child after 120 days of gestation, and also at the same time agree or believe or advocate that Roe v. Wade was a good opinion, that was good law. You cannot do both. You can't do both. You have to choose one or the other. You either agree that abortion is unlawful and sinful after 120 days, and the unlawful killing of an innocent soul, or you agree with the Supreme Court in Roe v. Wade that children can be killed in the womb up until really basically up until birth, and so there is no way around that. Now, what Roe v. Wade also said, of course, was that prior to what amounts to prior to viability, that abortion is permitted without restriction. And it is also true that some Muslim scholars, very, very few outlying Muslim scholars, said that abortion is permitted without restriction prior to 120 days. Very few said that. Those are outliers. One cannot adopt that opinion and at the same time pretend that one is adopting a mainstream Sunni Islamic opinion. Now, what one can do is adopt the Hanafi opinion, mainstream Hanafi opinion, that abortion is permitted before 120 days with excuses, and some of the ulama posited some of those excuses, and they differed on what some of those were. Some of them said, if you feared that the child would be would fall into disbelief and disobedience because of the time that you're in and the conditions that you're under, then that might be a situation which allowed it. Others allowed it in the case of rape or zina, adultery, and so on. However, it needs to be understood that many of these Hanafi scholars tied the permissibility of abortion prior to 120 days to the idea that takhliq or taswir occurs at 120 days, meaning the formation of Adamic features, the human features. And as Ibn Abidin discusses in his book Radd al-Muhtar, which is, by the way, often cited by people who are trying to portray and spin the Hanafi view as somehow equivalent to Roe v. Wade, which it certainly is not. Ibn Abidin discusses or relates the opinion that of earlier Hanafi scholars that there is a mistake in confusing the blowing in of the soul into the child with the takhliq or taswir, or the appearance of human features. And he points out that, in fact, the human features, of course, appear long before the blowing in of the soul. And so, to the extent that these Hanafi scholars were trying to say that they did not permit abortion after the formation of human features, then this has to be taken into consideration. Now, it wasn't only Hanafi scholars; it was also Shafi'is and Hanbalis and others who said that abortion is not permitted prior to 120 days, prior to the blowing in of the soul. When it is, in fact, it is not permitted after takhliq or after taswir, after the formation of human features. Ibn Rajab discussed this, and Shinqiti has a very beautiful discussion of this. He says, subhanAllah, he says that if it is not permitted in the Quran, Allah forbids us to mutilate the faces of and cut the ears and so on of cattle, then how much more forbidden is it, subhanAllah, to mutilate and destroy the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala of the face of a child? Can you imagine that? Do you know what abortion is doing prior to the blowing in of the soul, much less after? Prior to the blowing in of the soul, you have a human face at a very, very early stage. A human face, a human child, which is smiling, which is sucking its thumb, which is sneezing, which is turning around, which is doing all of these things that we see in our own children. And now with the advent of sensitive ultrasound and MRIs and so on, we can see these things. And to take that face and mutilate it, destroy it, crush it, which is what abortionists do. Crush it, crush the face, slice open the face, cut off the arms and the limbs with those fingers that have fingerprints on them, and vacuum this child out and flush it down a toilet, or flush it into a sink, or sell the parts of this creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is heartless and cruel, and it's whatever, and as I'll discuss in a moment, whatever possible autonomy or other so-called rights that people have, in no way do these overcome the enormity of and the gruesomeness and the fitra, the innate human nature finds this to be cruel and repulsive. So the real question and the real issue when it comes to fiqh, in reality is prior to the time of taswir and takhliq. And I say this acknowledging that there are those who said that after the creation of human features and prior to the soul being blown in, that abortion is permitted in that time. There were some of those who said that, or who could be interpreted as saying that, certainly. But it is not the majority view of the madhabs, and nor would it most likely be the view of these ulama if they had the technology and the understanding and the ability to see these human features, which they actually, many of them, discussed to be so important in questioning whether or not this is permitted. So Roe v. Wade allows this frankly Holocaust of human souls, and it allowed this destruction of the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ, Allah says, and we have ennobled Bani Adam. So this noble visage, this noble face, and this Roe v. Wade allowed this mutilation, destruction, and dishonoring. And also, one other thing to mention is that the Hanafi scholars also said, among others said this as well, but the Hanafis said this, that in the same way that it is haram to destroy an egg on Hajj, in Ihram, likewise, that this same analogy applies to the killing of a child, or the termination of pregnancy prior to the 120 days, because of the potentiality of life. So in other words, that where they were forbidden from hunting while in Ihram on Hajj, likewise, we're also prohibited from breaking an egg. This is the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. So from this same analogy, an egg is not, does not have a soul in it. And by the way, nor do animals have a soul in them. An egg is potential life, and yet we are forbidden from breaking an egg on Hajj. Likewise, the Hanafi ulama, many of them forbade, or at least made makruh, the killing or the termination of pregnancies prior to 120 days, or even prior to taswir, on the same grounds. And anyone who wants more information on that, inshallah, my paper will be coming out soon in Muslim Matters. But here's a very, very important point, okay? The very important point is this. What about the values? What about the values of Roe v. Wade? And what about the values of Islam? What about the aims and noble purposes of the Sharia versus the aims and ratio legis, or the rationale behind Roe v. Wade? What about the political history behind Roe v. Wade? What about the ideological grounding of Roe v. Wade compared to the noble values of Islam? Well, it's very important to understand that Roe v. Wade did not come out of nowhere. Roe v. Wade itself acknowledged that it was the product of very significant changes in public attitudes towards abortion, And more importantly, and this is critical, attitudes towards abortion changed as part of a broader change in public attitudes towards sexuality and towards morality and towards belief. The Roe v. Wade was the product of a long, decades-long attempt to liberalize the laws and public attitudes towards abortion, towards sexuality, and towards actually, in fact, human nature, and the aim of the human being, the good of the human being. Margaret Sanger, who was the founder of Planned Parenthood, as is well known, despite the efforts of some of her defenders to sanitize this, was a very, very staunch eugenicist. She believed that undesirable elements of the population should be eliminated through birth control, because they were, in fact, causing race suicide, or were lowering the quality of the race. She had involved in her organization and in her publications. She had eugenicists who had studied and taught and were affiliated with Eugenics Institute in Nazi Germany. Her counterpart in the United Kingdom, Marie Stopes, wrote a love letter to Hitler. She wrote a letter to Hitler sending him love poems and urging that he distribute this to the youth in Germany, her love poems that she wrote, and so on. And there is a very, very intimate, close connection between the founders and the original ideologues behind the liberalization of abortion and contraception laws, and the racist eugenics project. And all of this will be detailed more in my forthcoming project. Islam does not support that. Islam does not believe that undesirable people should not be allowed to breed. You know, Islam does not believe that there are certain people whose birth rates should be suppressed, whether those are of certain races, or whether they are of economic groups or geographic groups. Islam has no such thing, so we reject that. Roe v. Wade cited in its footnotes the author, Justice Blackmun, the author of the majority opinion in Roe, cited members of the Eugenics Society of America and of England several times in his in the footnotes. And likewise, Margaret Sanger and others who were behind the liberalization of contraceptive and then eventually abortion laws was a rabid atheist. The original slogan of her newspaper that she used to distribute in the streets of New York was "No gods, no masters." No gods, no masters. She was an anarchist and an atheist, and that was her point of view. And she also believed that traditional family was extremely destructive to the struggle for women's liberation. Now, obviously, we can disagree and from an Islamic point of view and from our own values, and see that the treatment of women in America at a certain period was very bad, just in the same way that we can see that certain elements of culture that are prevalent in the Muslim world are contrary to those values, and we can stand for the rights of women on the basis of those Islamic values. But we can't stand for that on the basis of values like atheism or anarchism or human liberation and so on, which arise from very dangerous and very evil, in fact, premises. And interestingly enough, because Margaret Sanger was such a radical, and other elements of the movement to liberalize abortion laws were very, very conservative. For example, eugenicists, and also, as I'll discuss, the population control movement. It made something of a a difficult sort of relationship between her and these more conservative movements or elements of the movement, but in any event, they made it work somehow. They found common cause. Likewise, you have the population control movement, which really took off with the writing of certain books that were warning that the apparent so-called burgeoning, allegedly burgeoning population of the Earth was going to take food out of the mouths of those who really mattered, and that is white folks in the first world. So it really was a major threat. It was seen as a major threat by certain elements of Western society that the increasing population of India, Africa, and so on, and as well undesirable quote unquote populations in the West itself. That the more these people bred, the more children these people had, the harder and more difficult and less comfortable it would get for folks in the for the folks who mattered, and that is rich white folks. Okay, so for this reason, the population control movement really took off, and it actually gained some measure of public acceptance. And many eugenicists, after the debacle of Nazi Germany and giving the giving of eugenics a bad name, changed their faces to become part of the population control movement, including people who were cited in the footnotes of Roe v. Wade. So, what happens with this population control movement? Nixon created a population control commission, the Rockefeller Commission, which 2 years before Roe v. Wade issued a report saying that abortion had to be, the laws against abortion had to be liberalized because abortion was a key aspect of limiting the Earth's population. And so this is the background of Roe v. Wade. Roe actually cited, many of the cases that Roe cited, is particularly a Connecticut district court case, relied heavily on the notion that the Earth's population was burgeoning, was out of control, and that abortion was necessary in order to prevent these births and this population. So again, is this Islam's values? No. Islam does not teach us to terminate our children and kill our children in the womb because out of fear that they will somehow take food out of our mouths, much less to take them food out of the mouths of particular groups who imagine themselves to be more worthy of life and dignity than others. This is what is behind Roe v. Wade. And now, what about autonomy? What about this value of autonomy that later somehow Roe v. Wade was assessed to have been promoting this value? Well, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which is a case that came out in 82, upheld Roe v. Wade, modified it very slightly, but more or less said that Roe v. Wade stood for the notion that there is a right to autonomy, bodily autonomy, which women have to kill their child, to terminate pregnancy. And somehow they found this right in the Constitution somewhere. Well, Dobbs, the case that was released today, said no, there's no such right that exists which creates that. Now, does Islam allow that? Does Islam say that first of all, does Islam say that somehow or another we human beings, or in the case of abortion, women, have a right to do with their body whatever they please? No, we don't have a right to do with our bodies whatever we please. I don't have a right to go out and drive drunk. I don't have a right to, in fact, smoke goods, even if they supposedly do not harm others. You know why? Because they for many reasons, but one reason is that they detract from the common good. We don't see our actions as in isolation from our duties and responsibilities and the rights to others and the rights of others. Everything that I do potentially can affect others, and so therefore potentially there exists the possibility that God and therefore as well human law can regulate those things. That doesn't mean that we would permit the absolutely unfettered penetration into our private lives of the government. No, but it just means that there is no such absolute right to autonomy. And likewise with a child in the womb, you do not have, just in the same way you don't have absolute right to commit suicide, you do not have an absolute right to harm the creation of God, especially when the soul has been blown into it, and at that point there is no autonomy whatsoever. And to the extent that any sort of autonomy exists, that autonomy can be is overridden when it comes to the a matter that God, Allah and His Messenger have ordained. And in the case of the fetus in the womb, even before 120 days, as I said, many ulama said, in fact, most ulama said that it is forbidden to terminate this child at various stages, whether at taswir and takhliq or before that, as Ghazali and the Malikis say. And what about the value of sexual liberation, the sexual revolution? This was also a major driver of the values behind Roe v. Wade. Look at what happens when Freudian psychologists come from Germany and Austria. What the author of the book, The Sexual Revolution, the one who invented that term, was a Freudian who promoted the idea that human beings can only be liberated as a liberatory project of the human race. This can only happen when the sexual act is separated permanently from procreation. And for that reason, the sexual revolutionary movement, which is Freudian in its nature, but also, of course, ultimately goes back to its roots in the Enlightenment and so on. This project sought through sexuality to liberate human beings, and this idea can be found in the writings of Margaret Sanger as well, who picked up on this, and likewise many in first and second wave, and certainly third wave feminism. And so this is an evil idea. We cannot separate. To separate the procreation from sex is to set loose, and not only that, to idolize sexuality as some sort of means of human liberation. The sexual act is a rebellion against God. It is a devotion of the soul and a worship of the desires, of lowly desires, which are good and beautiful when they are turned toward the aim and the goal and the purpose that God created them for, which is the love and enjoyment between a husband and wife, and which is the connected intimately and permanently and inherently with having children, even when in certain circumstances children may not issue because of infertility and so on. Nevertheless, there cannot be the sexual act cannot be separated from marriage, from love, and from procreation. And so, the sexual revolution has unleashed a vast array of harms in the West, from not to mention sexually transmitted diseases, the breakdown of the family, and the family, because the family is the building block of society, the destruction of and the downfall and the decline and the decadence of Western civilization itself. And not only Western civilization, but to the extent that this idea is picked up in non-Western cultures, then it harms them as well. to that extent. And so these are all the values that are underlying Roe v. Wade. These are the values that resulted in the liberation of the liberalization of abortion laws in states, and which was then ratified by the Supreme Court. With this recent opinion overruling Roe v. Wade, we see the rejection of this of the enshrinement of these evil, frankly very evil, inhuman, anti-human values, the enshrinement of these values in law, these in federal law. These laws have now been rejected. These values have now been rejected as a basis of law, or as having some sort of origin in the Constitution. And they certainly have no such origin in the Constitution, insofar as the Constitution is itself an expression of natural law. That law which God did, in fact, write on the hearts of every human being as part of creation. The fitrah, the nature of the human being, by its nature, rejects these evil values. And so any interpretation of the Constitution which enshrines these values has to be rejected. And we have to celebrate the rejection of these. We have to celebrate the rejection of these values, and we have to celebrate the rejection of a law that permitted the destruction, the murder, the Holocaust of innocent souls. And the prior to the blowing in of the soul, the destruction, the mutilation of the features of Bani Adam, the creation of God, the noble visages, the noble face, the noble hands, the noble eyes and smile of these children who would be born. The Prophet ﷺ said that on the Day of Judgment, the miscarried child would drag his parents into Jannah by the umbilical cord. He will drag his parents into paradise by the umbilical cord, and there is no there is a difference of opinion as to whether this applies to those children born after the soul was blown in, or who died after the soul was blown in, or before. Do you believe, and can we believe that the parent who deliberately, intentionally murdered, destroyed the child in the womb, that the child will that this applies to such folks? No, it doesn't. And so we know that all automatically that we're outside the scope of what the Prophet ﷺ imagined. It is inhuman, and it is wrong to do that. Now, are there some circumstances, according to some scholars, under which abortion prior to 120 days is permitted? Yes, some scholars did permit that. Absolutely, they did. But I want to be very clear about something. The mere fact that some scholars permitted that, and those scholars who did so under very strict conditions, and many of them did not permit it again after 40 days or after taswir and takhliq. So it's not an unqualified thing. Those who did it did not permit it for the reasons that are advanced by Roe v. Wade and by legislatures. So we cannot associate ourselves with these laws and with these values. We have to stick within our tradition. If we don't, then we're doing is we're taking off our Muslim hat and we're putting on our whatever hat, our Western hat. And Allah says He did not create in our hearts two souls. He did not create in our chests two hearts. You can only have one heart. Otherwise, you suffer from cognitive dissonance, and ultimately one is going to take over. So we have to choose, and we have to decide where do we stand. Are we adherents to some sort of innovative, anti-human, revolutionary Enlightenment view, or do we stick to the absolute, permanent, eternal truths which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed to us? So that's the question. So when we discuss either in our personal lives and make decisions in our personal lives about what we're going to do, or we are public Muslim leaders and we make pronouncements and so on. We have to do so from within our tradition and our beliefs that we know to be true, and not trying to step outside of that somehow, and say, and formulate ideas on the basis of premises and principles which are inherently violate what we know to be true. Otherwise, it's incoherent. It's schizophrenic. You can't do it. I just want to address one last thing. Well, two last things. So what that means is, could we see a way to permit abortion, or to say that abortion could be permitted under certain circumstances prior to 120 days? Yeah, a Muslim could make that argument. I don't make that argument. I don't agree with it. I think that abortion is. I follow the Maliki school, and I follow the Maliki opinion and the opinion of Imam al-Ghazali, that abortion is forbidden from conception, except to save the life of a mother. But there are ulama who said that is permitted, and so one could say, for example, if there were to be some massive harms and so on that would result, including the deaths of women and so on, that perhaps some argument could be made for the permission of abortion under certain circumstances prior to 120 days, and this would be consonant with the views of many of the ulama. But at the same time, taking into account, as we must take into account the important concept of taswir and takhliq, which the people who want to cast the Islamic view on abortion as solely compatible with liberalism and so on, ignore. We can't ignore that. This is a critical important point. But if for some reason through ijtihad, some scholars said that in these situations that we could be permitted to advocate for or to accept the permissibility of abortion under certain circumstances, that's fine. But here's the interesting thing: the law in Dobbs in Mississippi, which overrules Roe v. Wade. This law is equivalent or similar to, analogous to, the most liberal opinion in a mainstream opinion in Sunni Islam, which is that abortion is permitted prior to 120 days under certain circumstances. The law in Mississippi forbids abortion after a certain date. I forget how many weeks it is, but it's not far off, not much earlier than ensoulment, not much